There's a news alert. President Trump confirming that he's going to travel to both Israel and Egypt on Monday to discuss the future of Gaza.
In Israel, he is expected to visit Jerusalem to address the Knesset on the historic peace deal reached with Hamas.
Alexandria Hoff joins us now from Washington with the latest. Good morning, Alexandria.
Well, good morning to you three. We are within the 72-hour window that Hamas has to release the remaining hostages. And President Trump is set to be on the ground Monday in the region when he expects that to happen. With the ceasefire in effect, Israeli troops have pulled back to the agreed line in Gaza as part of the first phase of this agreement to end the war. And this has allowed tens of thousands of Palestinians to start trekking back through ruins towards Gaza City to uncover if they have homes to return to. Increased shipments of aid into Gaza are reported to begin tomorrow. Israel also expected to soon release roughly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners for the hostages held in Gaza. In Tel Aviv, celebrations took place this week as the first phase of President Trump's deal was announced, aimed at ending Israel's two-year war with Hamas. The next phase of this 20-point peace plan are when things could get even more tense, but President Trump is feeling optimistic and is expected to participate in a formal peace deal signing while in Egypt.
I think you're going to have tremendous success, and Gaza is going to be rebuilt. And you have some very wealthy countries, as you know, over there. And it would take a small fraction of their wealth to do that. But and I think they want to do it. And we're also setting up, as you know, a board of peace. It's called the Board of Peace. I don't know if that's the final name, but the word peace is definitely in there. They have asked me if I chair it. We'll make sure things go well.
So the return of hostages to Israel has been a mainstay goal of President Trump's. 20 are believed to still be alive. In addition, the president explained that Hamas is unearthing, as he called it, 28 bodies as well to be released. Guys.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, Alex, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. You know, I love seeing the pictures of the people in Israel dancing with the what do you call the paper mache
Donald
head
Trump.
of Donald Trump. I mean, they're happy. And then they're not just happy that the hostages are coming back. They are exhausted of war as well. I mean, I remember when I had the son of a hostage who actually was killed, and he's calling for his body to come back. That was over 2 weeks ago when I had him on the show and I interviewed him. He expressed that. He said, we're exhausted from the war.
Yeah.
We want it to end. And then, of course, you see on the other side, amazing images have also come out of little children, you know, cheering and dancing just like they are in Israel.
Yeah, they're dancing in Gaza as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you look at these scenes of joyousness, and then you think about back here in the United States, you have political partisans on the Democrat Party who are looking at this and they're feeling sour grapes, not over the fact necessarily that there's peace, but the fact that Donald Trump is the one who achieved the peace. Yeah. And the idea that you would take a moment like this where you have the best shot at true peace that maybe we've ever seen in the history of the state of Israel, and then you have people who are looking at it through a political lens, noting that you know, celebrating the peace deal itself, but refusing to give credit to Donald Trump because they hate Donald Trump more than they love the idea of peace. People like former President Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, Mark Warner, senator from Virginia, supposedly a purple state, Jackie Rosen, senator from Nevada, Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, Hakeem Jeffries are among those who would rather, are more upset about the fact that Donald Trump was the one who achieved the peace than they are that peace is broken out.
Obama's so jealous.
Yeah.
It's such an ugly look.
Same with the Biden people.
Yeah.
Well, and the Biden people weighed in. So here's the headline out of Politico. Biden's team watches Gaza with mixed feelings. In the piece, they say Biden administration officials are thrilled that a ceasefire is taking hold and that the hostages will be freed. But they also have a bit of sour grapes, to your point, Charlie, arguing that they laid the groundwork for Trump's effort and that he could have executed on it much earlier. Some former Biden officials, including senior aides to the president and vice president, have been soul-searching in recent months about whether they could have done more to stop the war. So President Trump gets us to a goal that eluded multiple administrations, particularly the Biden administration, and does exactly the opposite of what the Biden administration did. And the Biden administration's response is, well, you did it, but not quick enough.
Well, it's bizarre because the entire, war started under Joe Biden's watch. He didn't end it. And then he's like, President Trump, you had 7 months to do this and you didn't do it, or 8 months or whatever. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable that he would say that. And also, the war winding down had a lot to do with President Trump's relationship with both Bibi, but make no mistake, also with the Arab world.
Absolutely.
Joe Biden did not have those kinds of relationships with the Saudis or with the people in Qatar, the leaders of Qatar. He did not have any of these relationships. And he also had the relationship with Bibi where he could say, knock it off, like when Bibi bombed the negotiators in Qatar.
Right.
I mean, Trump had that kind of relationship to call both sides out and get them to stop.
Look, the Biden administration appeased Hamas and didn't put pressure on them. Trump put pressure on them. The Biden administration
on both sides
tried to publicly bring heat on Netanyahu, and yet President Trump has developed the closest relationship with Bibi of any American president. And then when it counted, he wasn't afraid to lean in as well.
That's right.
An entirely different approach. And to be fair, a few Democrats have given him credit where credit is indeed due. John Fetterman was one among the first to thank President Trump. And surprisingly, actually, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came out and gave President Trump credit. Listen here.
It's a really significant first step, and I really commend President Trump and his administration, as well as Arab leaders in the region, for making the commitment to the 20-point plan and seeing a path forward for what's often called the day after.
Griff, how much of this, concession that she's making that really, Donald Trump, President Trump deserves credit for this, has to do with the fact that she was Secretary of State. She knows how difficult
She
this
does.
problem is.
And it's a really great point, Rachel. What Secretary Clinton is highlighting is not just the ceasefire and the return of the hostages, but the larger part, which is a lasting peace in the Middle East. And I think that's because she knows that during the first Trump administration, the Abraham Accords, which brought forth Israel normalizing relationships with some Arab countries. If they can get all of the Arab world to normalize relations with Israel, we are going to be looking at a situation in the Middle East that hasn't existed for half a century. And everybody there, President Trump with his 20-point plan, pushes it that way. And all of a sudden, the Arab world and Israel say, yeah, this is a different world we could live in. This is the world we want to live in, not the one for decades that has failed.
All right.
And it took a real estate developer to present the vision.
And his real estate buddies. We could solve everything this way. I love it.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.